Hello, good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the New School. My name is Amanda Parmer, and I'm the curator for the Panelists Center for Art and Politics here at the New School. On behalf of the Panelists Center, the New School, and the leadership of the New School, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the second ArtTable Annual Leadership Series, Arts, Partnerships, and the Transformation of Cities. It is an honor for the Panelists Center to be hosting this series with ArtTable, whose dedication to supporting the leadership of women in the visual arts began as a grassroots initiative in 1980 and now supports a vibrant national network. As you may know, the Panelists Center was established at the New School in 1992 with an endowment from the University Life trustee, Panelists. As we celebrate our 25th anniversary this fall, it's thrilling to see the affinities between networks such as ours and those of ArtTable supporting one another. Tonight, being exemplary of this work, I look forward to learning the ways that these women have advanced the conversation and exchange between artistic practices in the private and public sectors around the country. While there are many aspects of this program that our organizations hold in common, perhaps primary amongst them is the scaling between micro and macro perspectives in the arts and fostering the inclusion of artistic practices in the social and cultural fabric of the city. It's wonderful to see how such initiatives resonate with programming that we're currently developing this fall at the Panelists Center, the only organization focused exclusively on advancing research, scholarship, and public discourse on contemporary issues at the intersection of art and politics. Next week, Friday, November 3rd, and Saturday, November 4th, we will host our International Biennial Prize Conference, highlighting the Center's networks of writers, scholars, and artists in a two-day conference that includes a keynote conversation between Saidiya Hartman and Maria Teresa Alves, a series of panel discussions, and the opening of the exhibition Maria Teresa Alves, Seeds of Change, New York, A Botany of Colonization. Another related program of ours is Indigenous New York, that similarly ensures a future inclusive of artists and their practices in the growth of a city's infrastructure. In the case of Indigenous New York, we're facilitating collaborations and exchange among contemporary curators, artists, and critics, as well as scholars that focus on Indigenous production and forms of contemporary colonialism, positioning the local as evidence of concerns shared globally. The next in this series will take place on Saturday, November 18th, and information about both of these endeavors can be found on our website. In considering the maintenance and support of these spaces, I would like to thank you all for coming. I would also like to thank my colleagues at the New School, Karen Cooney, Emily Donnelly, Zoe Carey, and Pam Tillis, the members of the Panelists Center Advisory Committee, and I would also like to express my deep appreciation to ArtTable and the speakers this evening for what I am sure will be a very important conversation. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Ada Siniglio, who is the Executive Director of ArtTable. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you, Amanda. It's a great pleasure to share the stage with the New School once again in this collaboration of ArtTable with the Panelists Center and the Center for New York City Affairs. I must admit that I had some trepidation when this panel finally came together. We are living in a time of such uncertainty that taking on a topic that extended beyond the traditional art world of galleries and museums, auction houses, and art fairs seemed fraught with uncomfortable possibility. Who would be our audience? And how would these panelists who come from such different places and lives and organizations interact once they were brought together? We're not going to know the answer to these questions till later, but we're thrilled tonight to have an audience as diverse as the cities which our panelists represent. Only about half of you here are members of ArtTable, which is a national organization comprised of a network of distinguished women in the myriad professions serving the visual arts. In your programs for this evening is more information about how you might join ArtTable, and I encourage you, if you're not already a member, to consider this possibility. This program, the second in our annual leadership series, is one of more than 150 programs that we produce each year, not only in New York, but also in our chapters, several of which are participating tonight in a live feed of this event. So a special welcome to our members and our guests here, and also in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. It is part of ArtTable's mission to encourage and support diversity in the professional world of the arts. Nowhere is that diversity more in evidence than in our cities. We know more clearly than ever that our cities are under threat from national disasters, from natural disasters, from the danger of shifting immigration laws, and from an ever more vocal minority whose values may sharply conflict with our own. What is the place of the arts in an environment like this one? We are grateful to our panelists, Laurie Beckelman, Sarah Calderon, Ava Franch, Deborah Rappaport, and Regina Smith, all women who have the courage to believe in a brighter future for our cities. And we are thankful to them and to this evening's sponsors, Bonhams and Hyperallergic, whose support is so critical to our efforts, and especially to Christy MacLear, our moderator, whose own career has always been one of working on behalf of artists and the art they make. Christy.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to talk about this subject tonight. We're going to focus on arts partnerships and the transformation of cities. It's actually a huge topic. We probably could dedicate an entire day to that. But instead of talking about how artists are gentrifying forces in neighborhoods and in urban development, I've asked our panelists to really give some new models and specific examples so we can begin to look beyond that. When we look out into how our cities are being shaped, there's so many amazing and innovative things that are happening, whether they're being politically engaged, whether it's forces with universities. So I think you're going to hear some really exciting new models beyond the traditional forces. As Ada mentioned, tonight we're linked to two different cities. We're linked to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to ask Ruth Abrams specifically to invite her colleagues to submit questions. We have 20 minutes for questions at the end. And I wanted to invite Ronnie Feinstein in Southern California to submit questions. Ronnie and I have worked together both at the Philip Johnson Glass House and at the Rauschenberg Foundation. So, Ronnie, I just wanted to say hi. Tonight, I have the easiest job. So I'm a moderator for these amazing women. And I basically am going to organize the evening into three parts. The first is I'm going to pass the microphone down. I've asked each of them to provide 3 to 5 minutes just on the projects that they're working on, the things that they're funding, so that you get a sense of the canvas of their experience. I have a couple of key questions to ask them related to one another, and for the last 20 minutes we're going to open it up for questions, so I do invite your participation. With that, I'm going to turn it to Laurie Beckelman, who also was one of my advisors at the Glass House, and she is a leader now building out the shed. So, Laurie.
Thank you. Thanks, Christy. It's really a pleasure to be here, to be a member of ArtTable, and to participate in this. And I owe a lot of you in the audience really my career, and I thank you because I've worked for some of you and with some of you over the years. And how this project first got started was really, I call this a Bloomberg legacy project. And what you're going to see, is somebody going to turn the slides at some point? Or not? Okay, great. I have 2 slides to show you. I'm going to be as brief as I can, because I'm hoping that once Christy introduces some questions, after that many of you will have questions. So let me start. This is the shed, originally known as the Culture Shed, and now it is known officially as the Shed. This is part of the redevelopment of the Hudson Yards. It's is being built on 30th Street between 10th and 11th Avenue. It is part of the Hudson Yards, which is 28 acres of new development. It is the largest real estate project ever built in the United States of America. It's quite overwhelming. It's really a city within a city. And I think what's most extraordinary during the Bloomberg administration and all of the great people that worked on it, they felt that, I think that the mayor and members of his key team wanted to ensure that New York was always on the cutting edge of culture and commerce, and the idea that there would be a cultural institution. And not to embarrass her, because I can't see her in the light, is Joan Chikakawa, who was at the time at the National Endowment for the Arts. You had Rocco Landesman there, you had Jamie Bennett, and there was this RFP to do a study. The city won this $100,000 grant, and we, Diller Scafidio and David Rockwell, in collaboration, came up with this idea of the culture shed, based on Cedric Price's work, a very entrepreneurial, visionary architect who didn't build very much, who unfortunately died, I think, at the age of 63 in the early 2000s, but everything being kinetic and moving and part of community and on the edge and digital, and this is what I think this is going to be. What is, I think, also remarkable about this building, and I'll go into it a little further after when I have a little more time, this is what it looks like right now. If you're on the High Line, you see the shed, 120 feet high, the whole building's 200,000 square feet. The shed, it's all type of arts forms. That not only will it have a lab for emerging New York artists, doesn't mean young artists, but emerging. It'll also have 2 museum quality spaces for both visual and performing arts. There'll be a theater of at least 500 seats, and in the shed you can have about 2,500 seating. I can go on and on of what we're going to build, but what I think is so remarkable, when the city redeveloped and rezoned this area, it's all private except for one piece, and that's where the shed is. It's on city land, so everything was rezoned private, and so that if the shed ever goes out of business, it'll revert back to the city, and this piece of land has to be used, this building, this piece of land, has to be used in perpetuity for culture. I think I'll stop there.
Hi. So I'll just give a very, very quick overview of Art Place America. Art Place is a 10-year collaboration of a number of foundations, federal agencies, and financial institutions. And we work to ensure that arts and culture are a core sector of community planning and development. Our goal is really to have more people use arts and culture strategies in community planning and development, and to build a strong creative placemaking field. We often ask ourselves 4 questions when we're looking at creative placemaking and funding. One is, what is the geographic community? The second is, what is the desired community change? The third is, how will arts help achieve this change? And the fourth, how will we know the change is happening? And then when we consider arts and culture, we think about artists engaging along a spectrum of their work when they're working with communities. So from studio practice to social practice, and then to civic practice work. And I should mention that we borrow this from our friend Michael Rode at the Center for Performance and Civic Practice, who's now at Arizona State University. And to differentiate how artists interact with the community and with their cities and around development work, we sort of ask these questions, which is, who decides, who executes, and what are the stakes as we think about projects and how they work. So that's just a very, very quick run through. And then I'll just highlight. We have these 2 matrices that we developed that are not sort of groundbreaking, but that we use to classify sort of how we think of community planning and development in the different sectors, and how we think about arts and culture. And our goal at Art Place is really, given that we're a limited fund, is to really understand how arts and culture works in these community development sectors across the country, and then to share that knowledge. And then I'll just highlight 2 projects. One is the Irrigate project, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. Some of you might have heard of this. It's a collaboration between Springboard for the Arts, which is a nonprofit, with the Twin Cities, the government, and then with Twin Cities LISC, which is a community development corporation. And the idea was to mitigate the disruption that was caused by the Green Line construction, and it brought artists together with local residents and with local businesses to try and figure out how can they, for the 3 years that this construction was happening, still bring people to the community and then ensure sort of economic development moving forward. So there were over 600 artists that collaborated with 150 on over 150 projects, and they received sort of 30 million positive media mentions along the corridor. And it was extremely successful, and many of the business owners are still partnering with the artists to do work in this community. And finally, I'll mention the Sugar Hill Children's Museum of Art and Storytelling, which was recently built in Harlem by Broadway Housing. If any of you have not visited, I highly recommend visiting. And it brings together a children's art museum, an early childhood education center, and housing for formerly homeless families. And it really changes sort of the narrative of the place and creates as well as creating a very significant building, and really creates a playground for kids that includes a museum and is very much, and the arts really drives a lot of what's happening in the area. So I'll stop with that so that we can move on. Thank you.
I think we can skip this. So welcome from San Francisco. I'm the founder and managing director of Minnesota Street Project, which is a 3-building, 115,000 square foot arts campus in southeastern San Francisco. To locate it for you, if any of you have flown into SFO and then driven up to San Francisco, we're the exits you don't get off of before you get up to Union Square and whatnot. Down in the southeastern part of the city, we have 3 buildings. They're all converted warehouses. The one that you see here is our only fully public building at 1275. We have 10 commercial real estate galleries. We have 1 nonprofit, the oldest arts education nonprofit in the city of San Francisco, started by Ruth Azawa. We have 4 rotating gallery spaces we make available to non-permanent tenants to come in. We just had quite a feather in our cap. Christie's does the San Francisco showing of their spring auction preview, and this time they brought the only Leonardo da Vinci in private hands. So we had a lot of excitement around the building this past several days. We also have 2 event spaces in this building. One that can hold, upward of 600 people standing, and one is a more intimate space that can seat about 30, depending on how we set up the tables. So inside this space, I've just got 2 slides here, one of the downstairs, one of the upstairs. And I just want to point out a couple of things. Behind those bleachers are all of our shared services. When we set out to do this, and I think I'll have a chance later to get deeper into the why and the how, but we wanted to be able to provide below market rents to galleries and artists because they were leaving San Francisco in droves. One way we did it was by building as many shared services into the project as we could. So behind those bleacher stairs, you'll find a fully outfitted kitchen break room, shipping and packing room, and 2 ADA restrooms that are large enough to take care of the entire building when it is full. So those are non-revenue producing things that a standalone gallery would have to be paying rent for. All these open doors that you see are galleries, except for the one at the end of the hall, which is the nonprofit. Moving along, this is 1240 Minnesota, directly across the street. It's our artist studio building. We have permanent studios for 37 artists, and with temporary resident artists and with what we refer to as facilities artists who have the use of the space but not a studio themselves. We estimate that we're able to serve between 60 and 80 working San Francisco Bay Area artists a year. This also is set up on the shared services model. We have a shared wood shop, a shared digital lab, a shared wet, black and white dark room, a shared kiln, and a lot of open space for people to be able to do things they don't have to do all the time, but that might take up a lot of space, like stretching a canvas or something. So again, the artists only have to rent the space that they actually need to do their work, and these are at both the artist studios and the galleries are well below market. How do we pay for it? Well, this is our third building. The black part is our offices, and a part you cannot see all the way to the north is where we have 3 other very large galleries, one of which is opening next weekend. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Nyan McAvoy. He's a great San Francisco collector and civic leader. He's opening up a foundation to show his art and art from other private collections, and we're really proud about that. In the middle, though, what you see where it's white is our art storage and services business. So when first we started with the galleries and the studios, but then we thought, okay, this is all below market. We're really happy to only break even on this deal, but we have to break even, so how are we going to do it? We founded and are now running a very successful art storage and services operation. We have 85,000 cubic feet of museum quality storage, plus cold storage, media storage, and unconditioned storage. We have clients from all over the country, and we also have 3 trucks now that go out and do various, installations, deinstallations, etc. That's one of the main revenue sources that we have, along with renting out our event spaces and a couple other things I can get into later if anybody is interested. So we have, I think that's all I brought. Yeah. So we have just those 3 buildings, but again, it's 10 commercial galleries, a nonprofit, 37 working artists, plus another 35 or so on a less permanent basis. 3 more big galleries, offices, and the art storage and services to try to help support it all.
Good evening. So let me see here. I'm going to talk just very briefly about our history as a foundation, because oftentimes when people think about the Kresge Foundation, they think about buildings, bricks and mortar. That's been our history, and it was a rich history, but it's one that really quickly began to evolve following the arrival of our current CEO, Rip Rapson. So when he arrived in 2006, that really was an opportunity for the foundation and its trustees to be able to think about how we might be more expansive and really think about really utilizing the resources of the foundation in a much more creative, holistic, and strategic way. So in 2007, we started to pivot away from facilities. And in 2009, by 2009, most of the programs really completed and sunset the facility strategy. And in 2011, really what emerged was a priority around this notion of opportunities for vulnerable populations in American cities. And that's really the foundation's mission. So we're a national foundation based in Metro Detroit. Our opportunity is, again, to think more strategically and holistically about how we might be supportive of in helping vulnerable populations move into the economic mainstream. There are 6 programs and 2 practices. I'm going to talk strategically and very specifically about the National Arts and Culture Program, which I manage. That program is not really a traditional arts and culture program. So as a foundation, some might think, well, we can apply to support either our facility or for our program, but not necessarily. The strategy that we're focused on, not unlike our colleagues at ArtPlace, is one that allows us to, if I go back, really address the bright line of expanding opportunities for American cities, and that for us is creative placemaking. So for us, it's the integration of arts, culture, and design, community engaged design into community development and urban planning practices. And so it's an approach to community development that allows us to utilize both grants and social investments, so loans essentially, and to target systems and behaviors so that we are strategically and holistically trying to address equitable outcomes for vulnerable populations. The types of things that we fund really hit on all 4 of these areas. So obviously it has to infuse arts, culture, and community engaged design. It has to either build on a community's existing assets and the distinctive attributes in that particular place. It's cross-sectoral or cross-disciplinary. And then lastly, it's really important, again, I mentioned kind of equitable solutions, so it takes root in economically distressed communities. But more importantly, it ensures that people with low incomes contribute to, engage in, benefit from, and ultimately are empowered by those activities. I'm going to stop there, because those are trends. Okay.
Thank you. So I'm going to take the full 5 minutes as the younger of this generation to probably present and try to take you through 50 slides and maybe 10 projects that explain a bit what Storefront for Art and Architecture is and does. Many people in this room will think that the Storefront is probably this facade. A project that was in fact commissioned in 1992 by Claudia Gould to Vito Conci and Stephen Hall as a collaboration to really try to produce an alternative way to understand a gallery space, to understand a wall, to understand the sidewalk. This pioneering project that was produced as a temporary project actually has lasted already for almost 25 years. And somehow it represents the mission of this institution that for 35 years has tried to produce an alternative platform for artists, architects, designers, poets, lawyers, anyone who's interested in the redefinition of public space, of cities, and public life. And so, the exhibitions, we do 5 different things: exhibitions, events, competitions, publications, and projects. And so exhibitions throughout these last 35 years have tried to understand how to learn from cities, not only here in New York. Storefront is based in Soho. We are 897 square feet, right? And from those 897 square feet, we really try to have a conversation with the world. We live in a global time. So this exhibition, Learning from Rio, was really trying to see how from the favelas and from ideas of painting urbanism and really distressed communities, we can actually learn how to change even New York City. Or this exhibition that last year looked into questions of sharing, and a moment in which we are living right now that is what I call the sharing movement. What can we do beyond technology, beyond economy, to really understand differently public space, the city? So we usually like to ask questions that no one does ask. Sometimes we are irreverent, but that's part of our mission. This exhibition that you can see in here was presented last year out of a kind of very strange feeling that many of us felt when we were walking around the city and we were seeing work in progress. And then a new luxury condo was showing up. And what happens where the entire city is painted in hunter green and says work in progress, and it's always a luxury condo. So what we did was to actually commission 30 different artists, architects, designers to reinvent and to reimagine work in progress signs that were around the city and try to produce and imagine new ideas, new visions for this city that is not being built around us. Of course, what we did was to put a fake fence in front of a storefront and to actually make people feel or fear that in fact we were also going to close and become the next commodity spa shop in Soho. Well, that might happen if we don't receive any funding, but we are not closing, so in just leaving any doubt outside. So from questions of manufacturing and where do things come from, and what is that in fact artists and designers are able to insert into the everyday objects that we live, to questions of surveillance and computational governmentability, learning in this case as well from the city of Rio and the way in which new ideas of smart city, are trying to make us be part of a world that we might not want to be part of. So taking from exhibitions to events, we really have taken always the city as our playground, maybe because our space is so small, but the idea that events and performances take the sidewalk and the city and any single instrument to produce an event and a conversation and a publication is part of what we have done. The competitions that we do usually ask questions that no one else does. In this case, this was a competition in partnership with the new museum to try to redefine those white tent competitions and bringing incredible visionaries into the jury, in this case again, Vito Conci, along with many others, trying to redefine what is that those temporary constructions in our streets should be. We give opportunities to emerging designers and architects and artists to try to really produce alternative ideas so that we can look above and see things that we never actually imagined. So taking the streets, we are always trying to push the boundaries. What you see in the back is a milk truck. Yes, it is a milk truck, but with a bubble, an inflatable bubble that was commissioned in 2007 as a project to try to insert speech buster in every single space. The project, produced by Ram Labor, a Berlin-based practice, has been traveling not only through New York City, but also went to Flint, Michigan. It has been to Minneapolis. It has been in Detroit. It has been in many different places, trying to actually insert a space of discussion and debate there where sometimes one might not find it. Sometimes it's a parking lot in the Bronx, sometimes it's under a bridge. And so we actually just had it in Central Park this Saturday. But what is interesting for us is to really produce projects that take us outside of our comfort zone. This project, actually funded when Christy was at the Kresge Foundation, thanks to an incredible visionary granting opportunity, was produced by Jimenez Lai as a gallery, like a storefront gallery, little 800 square feet, but into the streets. So trying to change the way in which we inhabit the space, in which we talk with each other, this has been mutating and transforming. We are now working together with Bryony Roberts and Mabel Wilson in a street performance here in Harlem, trying to understand the politics of race and performance and in terms of understanding streets. And so one of the projects that really dwells and speaks to the relationship between citizens, cities, politicians, and architects, but also designers, is this project we started here in 2014 that is called Letters to the Mayor. One of the things I realized is that we are not able to really produce relevant channels of communication. And so Letters to the Mayor started with 50 letters written by 50 architects to the mayor of New York City. From these 50 architects, 48 of them were women, 2 of them were men. I wanted to be inclusive. And so what was interesting about the project is that it was successful enough to the point that then the project has traveled to Panama City, Buenos Aires, Taipei, Taichung, Madrid, Lisbon, and this fall actually is opening in 7 different locations. I'm traveling on Wednesday to actually Valparaiso to open that edition. So what this project is doing is trying to bring architects in conversation with citizens and politicians to try to explain how do we want to think about the city of the future and who has the expertise, the knowledge, and the ability to do so. And how do we make artists, but also architects, to speak on behalf of citizens, not only of their own agendas. And so these projects, they bring the architects in forums together to have conversations and to really try to produce new forums of discussion and debate. Of course, last year we did Letters to the Developer, because we are interested in making those spaces change. And I think I'm going to stop here because Storefront does really get out of our little gallery space through international projects like the Storefront International Series. But one of the projects that I really wanted to show was ultimately this one, that is the worldwide storefront. What we have realized, what I have realized over the last few years is that a lot of people are doing incredible projects in many places around the world. And sometimes they are trying to reinvent the wheel and sometimes are really contributing new radical ideas. We as a gallery here in New York, what we attempt to do with this worldwide storefront is to produce a platform so that young emerging voices can really contribute to a global understanding of what it means to contribute locally while still speaking globally. So while we are extremely small and we want to remain to being small, we want to engage within this conversation within a global context of city making and place making by actually not only operating in New York or in the US, but to really operate globally in that space. So with that said, I think I'm done. Thanks.
Well done. 55 slides in 5 minutes. It's like its own gong show. I love it. If you can see, it's so great. We have 2 people in real estate, we have 2 funders, and we have 1 unbelievable big brain who I have loved. And I will say, I was proud when I was at the Rauschenberg Foundation that we made the decision to fund some of the things at Storefront, because there's so much about engagement of the artist in the development of, in this case, it was furniture to create engaging dialogues. I wanted to mention a project we also funded, and then I want to turn it over to our two funders and ask them what are some of the greatest projects that they funded. One of the ones that I remember really well as it related to artists and urban design was a young man, and I believe he was in Puerto Rico, and he made the decision that he wanted to beautify his village, but he wanted to do it in a way where he engaged in political dialogue. He decided to create a series of shades of green paint, and he actually asked people to paint their building whatever the shade of green that represented their political viewpoint. And despite the fact that you might think that this would create controversy, it ended up creating this unbelievable civic engagement. People on the basketball courts, people at the city hall, people at the schools were talking about what shade of green were they going to choose in order to paint. And by the end of the several months period, the entire village was a whole kaleidoscope of shades of green, and it created this civic discourse that was really totally phenomenal. So I just wanted to turn that over to you and ask the art funders, what are some of the things that best examples that they've seen?
Sure. It's funny, I'm actually thinking of some that we haven't funded as well. I think I'll highlight two things. One is I think that the idea of having artists in residence in cities has been really exciting. So in city government, I can think of two that have worked really well. One is that we haven't funded is actually at the New York City Department of Health here, and a woman named Elizabeth Hamby, who is an artist who does a lot of work around public housing. And she also has a position, I believe she's full-time at the Department of Health. And so it's really interesting to think about what she brings to that position and the different hats that she has to wear as she goes between sort of her life outside of work as an artist and what she brings as an artist to the Department of Health. And New York City has expanded sort of the number of artists in residence that they have, and have modeled it along on what has been happening in St. Paul, Minnesota, where they've had a lot of artists in residence. They have one particular one that's a fun story, which is Amanda Lovely, who realized that as an artist in residence that at the city, I think she's at the Department of Public Works, that people weren't coming to a lot of meetings, right? So that they'd send out surveys, nobody would respond, they'd send out people and have meetings and nobody could get there, and especially the people that they were interested in getting there. So the people who had two jobs, who couldn't find childcare, couldn't come to the meetings. And so she created a mobile van and called it sort of a pop-up meeting, and she created popsicles. In the flavor, and she created special flavors, so she had a St. Paul flavor, and gave out these free popsicles, and you would get a popsicle if you returned a filled out survey. And so that was a really different way of sort of thinking about engagement, and because she was at the city, created a platform for her to be able to reach people in a very different way.
So because Sarah and I actually end up funding quite a few of the same organizations and projects, I'll just riff off of the kind of artist and city example. It's been done before and it's not new, but I think the thing that in terms of trends that I'm finding really is that if it's public works, if it's transportation, law enforcement, planning, it's about helping those inside municipalities think more just differently about not just engagement, but it's thinking more expansively about the design. It's about policy and zoning. It's not exclusively for creative interventions, but it's really just about how people are utilizing space and how they want to utilize space. Or controlling the space in their communities. And so that's a way that artists and creatives have been able to work inside of each of these locations. So whether it's in St. Paul, whether it's the city of Fargo, Minneapolis, or DC Office of Planning, they're open to being just open to really working with artists and other types of creatives to be able to work in their communities differently. The other that I would mention is Mel Chen's working with MIT CoLab. And they're really just to take the Fundrit project to the next level. And specifically thinking about water and thinking about the hazards related to lead in urban areas in particular. And the work that he's doing both in DC and in Flint is just extraordinary. And again, that opportunity to kind of unlock the conversation around what's the role of a municipality to care for and to provide appropriate services and really safe services for residents in urban areas.
That's interesting about Mel Chin and MIT. Do you want to comment on Theaster Gates and the University of Chicago? Because I find it interesting, artists partnering with universities in order to advance policy, particularly.
Yeah, sure. Well, Theaster's work with University of Chicago is really in the Place Lab initiative that they've launched. It's really a part of a constellation of his activities and his enterprises. So in addition to Place Lab, there's Rebuild and as well as his individual practice. And I think the opportunity to work within the university and with the university and all of the merchants along that particular corridor, it means that there's a different type of energy. I think as an anchor institution, the university for decades has had an opportunity to not just be a real estate developer, but also a partner, but also to encourage employees to live in and around the neighborhood, but also their procurement practices could be different. And I think the opportunity that Place Lab and Theaster's work allows is, again, thinking well beyond just the infrastructure of what the university does or does not do in that particular neighborhood, but it's reimagining. It's about reimagining a corridor. It's about reimagining the uses of space, reimagining the uses of facilities, and people's relationship to residents' relationship to that place.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's a great fertile ground, a university ground, in order to allow an artist to imagine beyond. Stanford University, which is my alma mater, and I'm proud that because Deborah, you know this, San Francisco is a very expensive place for artists, and so our objective has been to create residencies for artists to come. So I'm interested from the real estate people, if you could speak about, that's Deborah and Laurie, just in case, if you could just talk a little bit about the chicken and the egg. Did the real estate come first? Did the artist come first? And how are these two engaged with one another?
Well, I'll kick it off if that's okay. The crisis came first for us. So I'm not sure if it was the fact that the artists and galleries were in crisis because the housing crisis had gotten so bad, but that was basically where we started. It's about 3.5 years ago, and it feels like 3.5 lifetimes ago. The news started to come out in San Francisco about galleries that had been in the same spaces for up to 35 years losing their leases because tech companies could come in and pay up to 10 times the square foot rent that the galleries could afford. And so, as I said, there were some, very, very established, very successful galleries that were suddenly kicked to the curb. And at the same time, artists that we knew or artists who worked for other gallerists that we were friends with were leaving town. I mean, for some reason, Santa Fe suddenly became a very popular place for artists to go. And people were they were leaving. They were either leaving so they could continue their art practice elsewhere, or they were just not doing art. The day job became the only job. And basically, my husband, I can't take full credit for this, it's a joint project with my husband. We decided that, we know enough about real estate in San Francisco to be dangerous and not enough to know what we were getting into. But we did realize that there's a special zoning regulation in the southeastern part of the city that would allow us to acquire warehouses without necessarily having to compete against large multinational developers. So it was what we did was it was a real estate solution to an art crisis that was happening in our city. And
So you started with a zoning loophole? Is that how this started?
We started with a zoning loophole. I guess I've never put it exactly that way, but it's true. The city of San Francisco wanted to keep the warehouse district with warehouses in it without, yet another historical part of San Francisco getting raised for, Class A offices and multi-million-dollar condos. So they developed a special zoning area, the southeastern plan, and for the warehouses had to remain doing what the warehouses had always done, which was classified by the city as production, distribution, and repair. Somebody, I don't know who, slipped 2 extra words into that, and those words were arts uses. No definition, no parameters, 2 words.
Everybody should remember that in the audience.
So we knew about it because, as I said, we have a little bit of investment real estate in the city. And this became known throughout in the real estate press or whatnot. And I was like, okay, this is an arts use. So we hit the ground running, and I want to make something very clear since I am surrounded by wonderful nonprofit practitioners. We are not a nonprofit. We had to work fast. This was, well, yeah. It was a triage operation for us, and I've worked with enough nonprofits to know that if we had gone the C3 route, we may not have even acquired a building by now, let alone have been open for over a year and a half, had over 100,000 people through our doors. So we set up as just an LLC so that we could make fast decisions. And my husband and I have board meetings in the car on the way to work. I'm not kidding.
You note on your website that the fact that you're a for-profit is a new model where you're actually acting on behalf of artists, but you're just using a corporate structure which allows you to expedite things.
Exactly.
So,
I call it for-profit philanthropy.
right.
We're not going to make any money on this. Our kids are real happy with the fact that we are basically spending their inheritance. But we will break even. We're this close to cash flow positive and should see that by the end of the year. And we also have a plan to get to break even, which for us just meant getting our cost of money out after what it cost to build everything. And had we done it as a nonprofit, there's a couple of reasons. One is because we could do it quickly, but the other is if I were an artist or a gallery owner and a nonprofit that was run by a single couple came to me and said, hey, we're building this thing and you can have rents at 1/3 of what you would otherwise have to pay, I would say that's fantastic, but what happens when you decide to go save the whales? What happens when your philanthropic focus changes? How do I know I'll still have a gallery or studio? Whereas doing it as a business with business leases and business responsibilities gives our tenants that confidence that we're not going to just pull the plug and go running off someplace else with our money.
Do you have a mission statement?
A vision statement?
A mission statement.
Not written down, no.
Mm-hmm.
That's another reason why we're not
values driven.
That's another reason why we're not a C3. Our mission is to provide secure, sustainable, affordable places in San Francisco for San Franciscan artists and workers in the arts to have a place to do their business with, the security of knowing that they have long leases that are renewable. We're the worst landlords in the world. We give people 3 to 5 year leases depending on where they are. And we already tell them ahead of time how much the rent increase is going to be at each renewal term. So, a gallery could have moved in March of 2016, March of 2016, and known exactly what their rent was going to be if they stayed in the same location in 15 years.
Well, I know from San Francisco, my best friend from San Francisco is in the audience, and I know that your project has had a remarkable effect. So I think whatever new model it is, it's just a groundbreaking one. So, and I wanted to turn to Laurie and ask, because the shed is a really interesting combination of, it was started as a facility, but I do believe that the program is really going to be the essence and the soul of this place. If you could speak to the artist's role.
I think that we're really an anomaly. And I think that if we weren't at a certain time in this city, this couldn't have been done. And it would have been integrated in as a part of the real estate. And we are so far apart from the real estate. And just wanted to give you a few words of how we've been thinking about it. And I've been a consultant on this project for over 7 years and had a wonderful small business that worked with cultural institutions and chose to leave that to work here full time because of the visionary CEO, artistic director, Alex Poots. And I'll explain a little bit. Invention, openness, quality, risk-taking, and interdependence are the hallmarks of our program. We're fueled by a synthesis of artistic and technological invention to create new works of art and new ways of collaborating. Alex brings an unparalleled reputation for ambitious, wide-ranging artists, programming, and dynamic cultural leadership. We are going to be creating groundbreaking new collaborations with all different types of artists. And I think what's so exciting about this particular building is, yes, the building is, I think, brilliantly challenging, no columns, so I think it's less challenging to some artists, but it'll enable artists to achieve their vision and create work that they can't do anywhere else. This performative design is purpose-built for artists, enabling them to create visionary, new work not possible anywhere. And I really need to stress that because it is so flexible. It'll accommodate the broadest range of programming. And when we've put together the board, it's a board that understands risk-taking. We're a startup. Yes, and it's an expensive building to build. I said 200,000 square feet. But there'll be a lot of it that's community-oriented, and I think that's what Alex has also been extremely interested in. As I mentioned, there's this New York lab that'll go on 365 days a year, and as well as all this great international program, so it's visual, performance, digital, technological. I can go on, but what he's also planning on doing, and hasn't been officially announced yet, is that series of programming throughout the building, throughout the year, that is called Open Call, working with individual artists, working with collaboratives, not-for-profits, for-profits, and figuring out how this building, not to be different, but really is saying that the workplace has changed, the artistic community has changed, and how can we assure in this very dynamic new city within a city that is high-end, challenged also next to very near low-income housing. We're already working with this group called Flexin in 20 schools, settlement houses, and NYCHA housing in the 5 boroughs. And how do you continue to incorporate that, engage people, get people to come where also you've paid $100 for your ticket. We figured out that I could only afford $5. You do not know that I paid $5 because I'm sitting next to you. I'm not in the back row. And I think Alex had this challenge when he was in Manchester, and that's what he's going to be doing in New York.
Alex was at the Park Avenue Armory, and I think that for me was one of the examples of taking over a historic structure and reimagining how an artist commission could breathe life into an area. I mean, I think some of those were sort of gob-stopping performances. So Ava, I want to turn it to you because you're my global person, and I do think I would love to hear, what do you see globally, some of the most exciting ideas outside of Storefront that inspire you? And how are urban designers looking at artists as a value in that dialogue? Can you tell me some great examples of that?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think we are in a moment in time in which art stands for many things, right? In which culture stands for many things. And I think there needs to be a schism, right? We need to probably start dividing and finding terminology to identify what is that is art with an agency, with an impact, with the ability to really produce a better world or a better city or a bit better understanding of public space, and art and culture that in fact just is interested in reifying the existing power structures that are based on finance, capital, and a particular idea of status quo. So understanding that obviously I'm interested in the first, not in the former, not in the latter, right? I think we have seen over the last 100 years of art production and the emergence of museums very different models. Right now in the world, at least in 2014, there were $200 billion invested in the production of new cultural facilities globally, right? Museums that had no collection, museums that had no program, but that had actually someone's investment or someone's finance or someone's ego behind it, right? So the question then is, okay, what's that about? And how does one measure that against some of the artist-driven initiatives that I find that actually are a group of friends who are 20 years old who actually want to have an impact in the parking lot behind their school or behind their neighborhood? And so when we started the worldwide storefront, we made an international open call, right? And we asked people, individuals or collectives not directly associated with any organization, to submit their idea for the production of an alternative project that would contribute immediately to their local context. And we would give them $1,000 as a startup capital. You would imagine that doesn't take you too far. Well, it took some people incredibly far, right? And that's for an institution that is not a funding institution, but is an institution that knows that that's the mechanism by which we can really enact change. So if one starts looking to the Biennale, right, and Triennale models, and what I call the Biennale fever, now every second year a new Biennale shows up, because mayors, politicians are interested in the kind of cultural capital and economic development that supposedly those cultural practices bring in. And then the question then yet it goes, how far does that go, and what kind of residue and contribution, and kind of what conversation is that producing? So I have always been fascinated in the way in which Documenta, for instance, a few years ago, and also Manifesta, started to really understand culture within different cities, meaning outside, getting out of their museum space, gallery space. And I think that that's really, for me, the model, right? And so going into an abandoned mining company and understanding the human edifices that were produced and were destroyed, and understanding that culture and art is not only about objects and matter, but also sometimes about the relationships and the buildings and the forms that are produced among people. So I think I'm really, Storefront as like an extremely small real estate space. We always say we are global and we are extremely ambitious in our scales of operations because we are looking to that kind of human footprint and those kind of relationships that are produced. And so when the Space Buster was just in its journey through Minneapolis and Chicago over the last 2 months in a project that was called We Like America, trying to have conversations around people that might not necessarily like each other, but that in fact are like each other in some other aspects. To me, I find that an extremely powerful form of engagement and cultural production and art production. So those kind of pop-up initiatives are happening constantly, and yet we don't have platforms that allow us to say, come here, have a look at them. I'm hunting them, I'm fishing them constantly, right? So that's why the Worldwide Storefront as an online platform wants to be that kind of a meeting space for all those different alternatives. As of now, I cannot tell you where to go and find them. I would say, come with me next week and I will show you some. Or we are right now working with people in Nashville who are really trying to really see how from the letters to the mayor, some of those initiatives can develop in urban strategies. So it's I don't have a list for you. I would say that it is probably, for me, one of the most important tasks to really be addressing today. And also, as funding institutions or organizations, what happens, who is funding projects that have a particular vision and not only a particular territory? Many times we are approached by the different consulates, right, of different countries, and they just want to fund people or spaces that actually respond to their flag, right? And I say, who is willing to stand up on the flag of cultural justice? Who is willing to stand on the flag of that what is right within a global context? And so we are operating from Soho, but ultimately, as you say, our mind is that one of a global citizen. So I hope that in 2 years I will give you a much better answer, but we are working on that.
So we're running a little late, and I do want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask some questions. Does anybody want to ask a question of the panelists? And we also have LA and DC chiming in.
This has been a fascinating panel and series of projects that you've all been involved with. I kind of shared Ada's concerns at the beginning, thinking, how do you wrestle with an issue that is so huge in a way, and yet so important? And some of the things, you know, the title of this, the art partnerships and the transformation of cities. I think Theaster Gates and the work that he's doing in Chicago is, to me, one of the best examples of a partnership that takes into account some other things that you've said, which is, how do you control space in a community's, how do the citizens control their neighborhoods? That's a huge question for New York City. I mean, New York City, then that leads to a thought about in progress. And wondering if the mayor read those letters. And if he did, what is he doing about them? And what is the agency of any cultural organization in the city to engage on a kind of political level with the people who are making decisions about what is built where, what money is left for what is the budget for art, and all of those factors that play into the life of the city. And I think we live in a city, New York is chock-a-block full. And one of the things I love about New York is that I can hear music on the subway, I can see art on the subway walls, I can talk to people who are a lot different than me and kind of have an experience that takes me somewhere new. That's New York City. And so I appreciate the global platform, and I really appreciate the idea that art, in a way, to really bridge the gap, needs to move out of the kinds of institutions that have housed fine art, that are places that many people don't feel comfortable going to. You know, you've been to the museum in the city, you went there once, you're not ever going again. You took your kids when they were little. You know, it's how do you bring the art, which then leads me back to some of the projects you're doing in Minneapolis. You know, it's a melange that is so broad, but my sort of question, I guess personally, operating as an architect in the city is, how do you develop agency within the political structure of New York City on a scale that is smaller than the culture shed, but in a way trying to do similar things on a much more local level within the city? Sorry, that was a very broad and unfocused question.
I wanted to give you two examples, and I'll let you speak to New York. When you were speaking about equity and partnerships, two examples that I really love exist in Los Angeles. And they're partnerships between artists and museums. One is the Underground Museum, who partnered with LA MoCA, So instead of, busing people to the museum, this really was about how did this community create their own culture and brought LA MoCA to them in order to create this incredibly vibrant and rich organization that I think has had a remarkable effect on that area. And the other is Mark Bradford, who didn't do that alone. He partnered with the Hammer Museum in order to make what Mark Bradford did for what essentially has transformed that area. So that's an artistic intervention, partnering with a museum who can help them understand how to administer, how to fund, how to become a part of the political fabric. I would leave it, though, maybe to a couple of you to talk about working in cities.
I just want to say that your question and your commentary, I think, Ada, would be really a good program all unto itself. Seriously. No, I mean that very sincerely, because it is the art and the architecture and the city.
Yeah, I guess I do. So as far from New York as it's possible to get, I'm not sure that other than the planning and building department, anyone in the city of San Francisco had any idea what we were doing. I'm still not sure they have any idea what we've done.
They do now.
What's that?
They do now.
Well, I'm not real in San Francisco now. But we started from the assumption, and this is something I feel very strongly about, and I think it speaks to your point, that nobody's born knowing how to go into an art institution of any sort, whether it be a museum or an art gallery or a symphony or not. The list goes on. Many of us, I'm sure, were lucky enough to have somebody when we were young who took us by the hand and walked us in and said, this is for you. You are allowed to be here. You're supposed to be here. You're welcomed here. Among other things, the neighborhood where Minnesota Street Project is located is surrounded by some of the poorest parts of San Francisco. And there are still a few. So we designed it, both architecturally and programmatically, to not put up barriers. It's free, and until you buy a piece of art from one of our gallerists, it doesn't cost anything. And it's hard to tell from the photos I shared, but our front door is a garage door. That's huge. It's like a 3-bay garage door. Because I agree with you that there need to be institutions in our cities, whether they're working with some political structure or just do it on their own because the political structure isn't doing it, that are welcoming, that are saying, we are not a museum with a $25 admission that says we're open to kids, but we're not open to their adults, so they can't come anyway. I'm sorry, that's my soapbox. But anyway, just in response to what you were saying.
I just want to make another comment, because I think one of the biggest challenges any one of these great institutions have, and it also looking at the architecture, even if you have an architecture that does not have the stairs, the steps going into the Met, which is the most unwelcoming and I've had many experience with people who have never been to a museum and trying to take them in, and they're petrified. Never, ever walked into it. And although the shed is all glass and there are many opportunities, one of the things that we decided to do, and it was not our idea, it was the community putting tremendous pressure on us, in that here you have the High Line. Yes, it's successful. There's lots of issues about how do you get New Yorkers, how do you get people in projects in there, is that one of the things that we've agreed to that we're building right now is that you do not need to pay anything to walk into this 9,000 square foot lobby, hang out, plug in phone, do nothing, and you can use a restroom at any time. And that has never been done in any other cultural institution. That being said, I think we'll be successful in certain things, but how do you get into community? I remember years ago when I worked at the Public Theater, it was a terrible time of homelessness in the city. I'm not saying it's terrible now, but I think it was even worse then. And we worked with homeless shelters, getting kids to come. We got buses, we brought them to the public, we fed them. And it was the only way I'm sure we could get them. And they started writing. And it was an incredible program under George Wolfe. But unless we start spending more time locally, I don't know how we're going to succeed.
Any other questions from the audience? It's really easy.
Hi, thank you. This has been really, really interesting. But I just have a question, both for Deborah and for you, Laurie. when you're designing these very big, open, welcoming spaces in communities where there isn't a habit of going to museums, do you ever think about sort of user experience design beyond having big open doors? And by that I mean, like when you're designing a website or an interactive, you think about visual cues that will make people feel familiar and comfortable and recognize, oh, this is what I can do here, and I feel like I belong here. I know what I'm doing here. And I haven't really heard you talk about that approach to making communities feel like they can recognize themselves in the outside of the building somehow. And so I'm just wondering if that's something.
So I mentioned our big atrium space, which we do rent out at market rates for for-profits and at very low reduced rates for nonprofits. We also have free programming that the project itself mounts in the atrium space to appeal to a broad range of folks, from the total art insider to the mom from the projects who's got a couple of kids she wants to get out of the house. We have done, and we are currently looking for a partner to help us continue to do quarterly community days where we just open up the doors and there's food and there's art making, there's music, there's stuff to make people feel like they can see themselves in the space. That's something that's sort of been baked into our plan from the very beginning. We're not fully successful in implementing it yet because, we had buildings we had to build and stuff, but our last space is opening next weekend, and then we can turn our minds to more things like programming.
I have a question from our online, which is, how long has it taken you, Deborah, to develop a sustaining audience for the exhibition program?
That's a really interesting question. So I guess we have to define our terms a little bit. Our exhibition program is primarily made up of standalone commercial galleries who do a lot of outreach, obviously, to their own clientele and to potential clients also. Our job as the project, as we see it, is to make the space as available and open and to market the you-know-what out of it, so as to give our galleries the greatest chance of success. We don't do very much presenting as a project at all. Like maybe twice so far in the past over a year and a half have we done that. But we do, as I said, we see our job as providing the environment to allow our tenants to be successful.
And I'm going to close with one last question, so we're sort of on time. And any of you are welcome to answer this. The question is, how many museums are participating in new and transformative partnerships in cities? Any of you have any examples?
I mean, someone who is not here but could very well be here is Lisa Phillips. The new museum has been doing really interesting partnerships with the entire community around the Lower East Side and the Bowery and Soho. And since 2011, we have been doing a series of Idea City initiatives that started here in New York and has been going in many cities around the world. And as one of the partners of that project, I do think that that's definitely a very interesting form of partnership. What I think is very important is that those partnerships keep being partnerships, and what a partnership means today in terms of fundraising or in terms of like really developing ideas is always difficult. But I think that's definitely one of the very interesting partnerships that is about cities, culture, and art. So.
Yeah. Any others?
I'll just mention the Wing Loop Museum in Seattle. very intentionally did not, during the redevelopment of their facility, chose not to add a cafe because they are in the heart of the International District. And as part of, and a partner, they're part of the Business Improvement District and the Merchants Association, and they value the other merchants and encourage visitors to go out, grab a bite, and come back. That's what an authentic relationship and partnership from an anchor cultural institution in that neighborhood, as not just it's a wonderful partnership, but again, it's very, very strategic, very thoughtful about where they are and the value of the place and the people in the place.
Yep.
I can give a shout out to the Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archive, which is affiliated with the University of California at Berkeley. They just built a rather amazing new building. And as part of the architecture, one side of the building is a screen, and they show free movies. They have, and it's not just theatrical movies, but it's anything pretty much that can be projected onto the side of the building. And the architecture itself is specifically designed to invite the neighborhood and the community in. It's off of campus now in a new location. So that is a Bay Area institution that I can speak
If I
about.
may do an advertisement for the shed. We'll open in April of 2019, and there's going to be a lot of free everything. Open areas, open everything. Alex, if he could have his way, would have every single gallery free and everything free. That being said, he's Scottish. He's originally from the United Kingdom, and we told him that, unfortunately, in America, especially in New York, we're not there yet, but maybe we're on our way.
Sarah, do you have one?
The ones that I'm thinking of are projects that we are going to announce funding for, but have not yet. But I do think that there has been a trend, and we've seen it in the applications that we've received, for museums really grounding themselves, as Regina spoke about, in place and trying to figure out sort of what is their community, not as an audience building option, but as something where they're really trying to think about how to serve the community members in the place where they are.
That's great. So I just want to thank all of the panelists, amazing dynamic ladies, and thank you very much for coming out. Appreciate it.